When somebody tells me nowadays that they don't see color, what they're saying is that they don't see me.
Welcome in, everyone, to the Louisiana Now podcast. I am your host, Todd Rossnagel. Great to have you along with us. This is the second episode of a series of episodes where we are focusing on the issue of racism and racial injustice. We are tackling these issues with 4 guests. 2 of those guests are from Project Curate, a nonprofit and consultancy that works with religious, academic, and community organizations. And from here in the Louisiana Conference, Reverend Ronald Southall will join us along with Reverend Clifton Conrad. It's important to note that this is episode 2. In episode 1, our last episode, we discussed how to approach the issues surrounding racism with a Christian lens. And in that episode, we began at a very high level to unpack systemic racism, which is defined as the systemic distribution of resources, power, and opportunity in a society to the benefits of people of one race, in America's case, the white race, and the exclusion of people of another race, and in our case, that would be people of color. Policies that were made a long time ago by people in power to create a system to preserve that power. Reverend Dr. Matt Russell said this.
This is Jesus' work. This is the work of the church in the next 20 years of our life together. This is the deep work of particularly the white church. We've got to go farther than we did in the civil rights movement. We have to do more work. The civil rights was seen as really the black church doing its work. I think that we are called right now in this time for the white church to do its work in a deeper way, to open that self up, to open our understanding up, and to understand that from a theological, spiritual, denominational standpoint.
So in some ways, it makes sense to tackle how the white people of America can begin to respond. Before that response can happen, though, we must understand what white privilege is. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about ways white people have knowingly or unknowingly avoided deep, meaningful conversations about race in the past. All that and more in this episode of Louisiana Now. Welcome in, everyone. I'm your host, Todd Rossnagel. It is great to have you along with us. If you are new to the podcast, thank you so much for joining us. We cover news, opportunities, and the witness of the Louisiana Conference of the United Methodist Church. And this episode is a tandem to last week's episode, so we encourage you to go and listen to that episode as well. We encourage you to subscribe to the Louisiana Now podcast and get all episodes delivered straight into your inbox. An important note before we get to today's content, we, the Louisiana Conference, will be hosting a webinar on this topic and more with our guests from Project Curate, who you'll hear from in this particular episode and last episode, next Wednesday on Zoom, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So that is next Wednesday, July 15th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Zoom. Registration is required. We're going to have a link to the registration and to our website. All of that can be found in the show notes, or you can also head to our website, la-umc.org, for more information. And now to our episode. And to begin our understanding of white privilege, here is Project Curate's Dr. Rachel Schneider.
All things being equal, same education, even the person who goes to Harvard can still be, as we know, actually with Christian Cooper and Henry Louis Gates, can still be subject to discriminatory treatment just by how they show up in the world, still be subject to violence for something that they cannot change or take away. So the idea of white privilege is saying, look, we know that just because people are Black or brown, they have disproportionate rates of incarceration, disproportionate rates of being subject to police violence. And so those things, are a product that, all things being equal, race is the thing that determines whether I live or I die in some instances. That's in a very stark way. But so I hope that makes sense. So it's not to say that white people don't struggle and that we don't have issues in our individual lives. But when we're out in the world, it's that our skin and the ways that people understand and read us doesn't detrimentally count as a negative, as it does for other people.
For Reverend Clifton Conrad, white privilege takes on a completely different meaning, a series of life events that many white people don't even begin to think about.
For me, white privilege means not having your heart skip a beat when you look in your rearview mirror and see a police car behind you. For me, white privilege means not going into an exclusive store and wondering if the clerk is watching you or following you. For me, white privilege is not wondering whether or not you didn't get that job because you were less qualified than the other person. For me, white privilege just means take full advantage of what this country has to offer her, without what this country has to offer everyone, without regards to your color or your religion or your ethnic background or any of that. It's just things that other cultures take for granted that we always have to think about, like walking through certain neighborhoods. I've always said that I'm more concerned for myself walking through some of the more exclusive, upscale, middle-class, predominantly white neighborhoods than I am walking through some of the harder neighborhoods in the black neighborhoods, because I can relate to them. They're not going to cause me any problems. They're not going to challenge why am I in their neighborhood. But the minute I step onto some streets, it's like Ahmaud Arbery jogging through a neighborhood where people thought that he shouldn't have been, because that was their white privilege. That was their neighborhood. It was like the professor in Dallas who was jogging through his neighborhood and got stopped by the police and didn't have his license on him, and they followed him to his house to make sure that he actually lived in the house where in that neighborhood. It's just things that we have to do, that we have to think about, that other cultures don't even have to think about, and just living their normal everyday lives.
For Reverend Dr. Matt Russell, understanding white privilege takes a lot of work, and it begins by not internalizing the larger issue with yourself individually, or to put it another way, as we talked about in our last episode, taking a step back and looking at matters with a wider lens.
Part of the work, I think, that I'm finding working with my own congregation and other white congregations is to help them to, in some ways, pull the personal out and to look at what Paul calls powers and principalities. The bigger picture of the world that we were born into. Because in some ways, what white folks, or the natural, I think the reaction that I would have is to say, I'm not a racist. My mom taught me how, and my dad taught me how not to look at color or to those kinds of things that I used as defenses. And when I began to pull those things away, to realize, I was born in a system that was structured around certain avenues of power, right? Or certain avenues that where I felt safe kind of in public spaces, and the ability to raise my hand in the middle of a class and to say anything I wanted, or to ability to work in a place where I feel like I could kind of do my best work, or being valued for what I contribute. All those things were just normal for me, right? And in some ways that was an entitlement that came with me being born white, right? And not realizing that, right? Not fearing being pulled over by police, and having my parents never had the talk with me, which I always thought was about the birds and the bees, which for folks of color, that's a different talk.
It is indeed a different talk. It's a talk that white people can, in some ways, not even begin to relate to. And for Reverend Ronald Southall, it's the practice of empathy that he says is vitally important for white people, encouraging, as difficult as it might be, for white people to place themselves or their loved ones in the same shoes of those being victimized.
Where they have to fear getting home or wonder if they're going to get home when they're pulled over by the police. Where they have to wonder more if they're going to get a job if they're not overly qualified. That someone of less qualifications because of their color and can get the job over them. What if we can get go into a bank and get a loan for business in order that we might create business opportunities within our community? What if we are able to, or what if the Eurocentric people are not able to obtain loans to purchase homes for their families, and they are charged higher interest rates for cars or homes than other people? How would that make you feel? If you want to be empathetic, you've got to be able to walk in my shoes and truly, not just say that you feel or understand, but truly feel what we feel.
And if I may add one more thing, Ronald, not feeling like you always have to have somebody white to vouch for you when you have an idea. It's like when you present the idea, if you don't have somebody white backing you up, your chances of being successful are reduced tremendously. So it always feels like we have to have somebody white's approval before we can even move forward.
When we return from the break, we'll look at one of the ways white people make things worse. And for the record, I've been guilty of this time and time again. We're back after this. The mission of the United Methodist Foundation of Louisiana is to be a catalyst that strengthens and preserves the current ministries of the conference while meeting the needs of a diverse and rapidly changing society. What does that mean for you and me? Well, within the last decade, the foundation loaned over $23 million to more than 100 United Methodist churches. These loans address the needs for expansion, renovation, or unexpected repairs, primarily so churches can be in a better position to meet the needs of the communities they serve. They've been awarding grants for a quarter of a century now, totaling over $5 million, and to think it all started with a $5,000 check back in 1975 at the first meeting. That check, referenced by the foundation as a mustard seed, took root and has now grown to over $145 million in managed assets, the fourth largest of all United Methodist foundations, and it has helped distribute hundreds of thousands of dollars each year to Christian ministries in Louisiana and throughout the world. Want to read more about that mustard seed? You can. It's one of the many stories featured on their website, umf.org. I am colorblind. I don't see black and white. Have you ever said this? Ever heard someone say it? I've said it. I grew up in a white town, and whenever race would come up, me and my white friends would quickly say what we were likely taught. I don't see color. I'm colorblind. I don't see in black and white. And honestly, it was a half-hearted way for me. I can't speak for my friends, but for me, it was a half-hearted way to be concerned about race relations, but at the same time, utterly disconnected from the deeper conversations. But here's the thing. I didn't invent that phrase. I heard it everywhere in my suburban upbringing. I heard it from my teachers, community leaders, random adults, even my parents. But at the end of the day, I've come to now realize that saying things like I don't see color, even though we all do, was just a way for me to avoid the conversation. A pacifier, if you will, that kept all of us from going deeper. In her book, White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo says, when we teach that things are not overtly racist, we are teaching self-censorship rather than teaching how to examine deeply embedded racial messages that we all absorb. She says, ideally, we would teach our children how to recognize and challenge prejudice rather than deny it. Race is always at play, even in its supposed absence. And for Reverend Clifton Conrad, the pacifier known as colorblindness is deeply personal.
When somebody tells me nowadays that they don't see color, what they're saying is that they don't see me. They're seeing something the way that they figure the world should be, which is not the way the world is. So in order to see the total person, you have to look at them for who they are, whether they have brown skin or white skin or whatever color you want to label their skin as. Because in actuality, there is no such thing as black skin or white skin. Everybody is just a varied shade of brown.
That's right.
If I say everyone's the same, that means that everyone is the same as me, because really what I do is I kind of evaluate sameness based on what is same to me. And I don't then have to, in some ways, what the epistles say is bear one another's burdens. I don't have to know the burden of what it feels like to grow up outside of the context I grew up, which may have been a burden context. Right, I'm not saying that it wasn't, but to say that everyone I don't see color is not to take into the account of the history of a burden of peoples that that I need to know in order to be in authentic, deep, gospel-oriented relationship. Right, and it almost subverts a type of curiosity, a spiritual discipline of curiosity that says, "What happened? I want to know your story." Right, in order to know who you are.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I'm thinking of a couple things. Not only does it prevent us from knowing other people's history, it prevents us from knowing our own history and having a clear picture of where we've come from and where we want to go. When I was 19, I took a trip as sort of a short-term mission trip to South Africa to learn about racial reconciliation and peace building. And that was really my awakening to the horrors of racial injustice. Even though I had grown up in a society that was steeped in racial injustice, I hadn't been taught to see it. And when I came back, and in the following years, I remember feeling, and I still feel this way sometimes when I think about my church and my family, a kind of betrayal. Really, that I hadn't been taught the truth of our country. I remember wondering, what were my parents doing during the civil rights movement? And I don't think I have good answers, but wanting to know, where did they stand? What did they think about race? What were my elders who were around me? What had they done? What had they supported or not supported? And as a younger person, really, really wanting some moral guidance, but also a way to understand myself in this American story and in this Christian American story.
If we look through the eyes of Jesus, Jesus says, I came for all. He did not come for white people. He did not come for black people. He did not come for rich people. He did not come for poor people, but he came for all people. And so no matter what your race is, no matter what side of the tracks you grew up on, Jesus came that we all might have life and have it more abundantly. So in that, if we truly say and we truly believe, because we are about to celebrate the creation or the newness of this country on July 4th. But in that celebration, it is standing up for what America is. And if we truly believe in what America is and what America stands for, we have to truly accept the words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, which says that all men are created equal. And therefore, let us build greater upon that. All men and women are created equal. And so therefore, there should not be any type of system that oppresses one group over the other.
As we mentioned earlier, we are going to be going even deeper on this topic and more when we are joined by our friends at Project Curate for a webinar Wednesday, July 15th at 2 p.m. All are invited. We encourage you to sign up and register for this Zoom webinar. Our guests will be Reverend Dr. Matt Russell and Dr. Rachel Schneider from Project Curate, introducing us to an important beginning point to the anti-racist conversation, what whiteness means in our society, how whiteness has been constructed and why, and how whiteness continues to perpetuate racist policies that lead to continued racial disparities and prejudices. All the information can be found on our website, la-umc.org. For our producer, Mary Burley, our sponsor, the United Methodist Foundation, I'm your host, Todd Rossnagel. May you leave this podcast with your ears pitched to the sound of God's voice calling your name.